So there are voices all around us telling us that life is a story about us.
Life is a story about you.
See what I mean? Now in chapter 2, there's a new analogy about the search for wisdom. Yes, it's widely available to all who fear the Lord, but it's also a treasure that needs to be sought out and embraced.
That's too much work. Just join my gang and we'll go get rich.
No, I'm not joining your gang, and can I finish this video?
Oh, well, excuse me for trying to recruit a gang member at an inconvenient time.
The parent writes, "My son, if you will receive my words and treasure my commandments within you, for if you cry for discernment, seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God." He's encouraging his son that this isn't an impossible standard. He really will find God's wisdom because God wants to be found. The Apostle James says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, without fault finding, and it will be given to him." So it's like God has these storehouses of wisdom that he wants to just pour out on us. And it's not our own effort that's paying off, it's God dumping wisdom into our empty hands. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, and he preserves the way of his godly ones. So there's security in knowing God like this. We'll see what he's shielding us from when we get to verse 12. But first it says, "Then you will discern righteousness and justice and equity and every good course." That's the same triad we saw in chapter 1. God's wisdom is right and just and fair. Now there's an interesting connection to these words in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 10 we see these wicked and unjust kings oppressing the poor, the widows, and the orphans in their land. God pronounces judgment on these oppressors when the Messiah, Israel's true king and deliverer, springs up to rule over the nations. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. But with righteousness he will judge the poor and make decisions with equity for the earth's afflicted." So in Isaiah and Proverbs, there's this connection between wisdom, fearing the Lord, and this result of justice and fairness. So when we live wisely, we share in God's concern for the weak, the poor, and the marginalized. So there's no question that Jesus' followers should be on the front lines of helping victims of oppression and injustice. A more complicated question is to what extent, if any, the government should play in these efforts. On the one hand, many Christians believe that it's only the church's job to address these social issues, and the government should stay out of it. And they note that Jesus and the apostles never said anything about starting a government program to further the kingdom. Many other Christians see a big discrepancy between what the church could do and what it does in practice. They see democracy as a potentially powerful tool that God can use to help us care for the least of these. In short, let's avoid the two extremes of being completely indifferent to the needs in our community and world and thinking that social justice is the gospel itself.
Look, man, I've been really patient with you. You join my gang or you're gonna get mugged.
So what is God shielding us from when he grants us wisdom? Discretion will guard you, understanding will watch over you, to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things. This guy's an example of that. The Father tells us to leave their path. The company we keep can be a good indicator of where our heart is in relation to God. Wisdom leads us to stick close to our brothers and sisters in arms who will hold our feet to the fire and help us become everything that God wants us to be. The next person that wisdom guards us against is the strange woman, meaning that she's from another household or outside the covenant community. Like the men trying to entice this youth into easy money, she's trying to entice him into easy sex. The author draws a creative parallel between these two. They both abandon their commitments to follow sinful paths and use their words to draw others down with them. We'll meet this woman again in chapter 5, but for now we're warned that her house sinks down to death and her tracks lead to the dead. None who go to her return again, nor do they reach the paths of life. Then the parent presents our choices again. We can either choose short-term pleasure and reap its consequences, or we can choose integrity and the stability of character that forms in the fire of discipline. And the father's hopeful for his son. He says, "So you will walk in the way of good men and keep the paths of the righteous. For the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it, but the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be uprooted from it." There's another parallel here between these outside enticements and the wicked being cut off from the land. For ancient Israel, being tied to the land was a tangible sign of God's blessing. So these thieves and this adulteress have cut themselves off from the land, they've left the covenant community of God, and they're more than happy to drag down with them any gullible soul who's not passionately fixed to God's guidance and living in the fear of the Lord. But how does God reward the righteous today? Can followers of Jesus expect tangible blessings like Israel? We'll talk about that in chapter 3.
Share and subscribe.